Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Estate Shorts. I'm Alex Morkate, and in this episode we're going to talk about present value, what it is, and how you can use it to help you decide what to pay in commercial real estate. Let's get started. So the agenda for the day is first we'll define what the present value is. We'll describe a couple different ways in which present value concepts are applied in commercial real estate. Obviously, we'll talk about the short and the longhand ways in which you can calculate present value. And then we'll talk about a handful of the important considerations that you should keep in mind when calculating or applying them. So diving in, first, what is present value? So I think the easiest way to think about present value is to define it as today's value of a future stream of cash flows. So let's imagine that you purchased a property and now you anticipate to collect rents and maybe even potentially sell the property at some point in the future. What present value helps you decide is what is the value today of all those future collections and cash flows. So just in case, I think a quick example outside of the context of real estate would be valuable. So let's say, for example, that you just won the lottery, $500 million. Congratulations. I'm sure you have a mix of emotions, surprise, excitement, anticipation about all the different things that you can do with your newfound winnings. But what if I added the caveat, saying that you needed to wait 150 years to collect the $500 million? I'm sure many of you would feel very different, disappointed, let down. I'm sure some of you would feel that now this $500 million isn't really worth as much to you today. Having to wait 150 years, the uncertainty of what could happen during that period of time, the likelihood of you actually even being able to collect and use that money in the way that you wanted to, the real worth of the $500 million at that point in time. So all those concepts are likely floating around in your head, even if just in the background, because I understand that intuitively, you likely took $500 million and said, you know, it's not worth the same today if I have to wait so far to get it. And I think that's really this concept of discounting. What we're trying to do is to take that qualitative feeling of, you know what, it's not worth as much because I have to wait. Now we're trying to find a way to quantify that feeling, to put a number to how much you've discounted and why. So a handful of the contexts or applications of present value. So we tend to find it obviously in valuation. So what is the value today? Or you could also hear it phrased as, what is the future stream of cash flows worth today? But I think just as important is trying to decide how much you should offer. And so this is really that distinction between price and value. So the value in the market may be one number and your price may be a very different number. So what's the most that I should be willing to pay, or what's the most that I should offer on this investment opportunity? There is a bit of a difference. The market's value and your price could be two different numbers. Present value could help us determine the difference between them. And obviously, let's not forget about lenders who are so critical to the entire commercial real estate industry. They too use present value concepts. They use them to help determine what they perceive value to be and the most that they should lend accordingly. And they also use it to help work backwards from an affordability perspective. So knowing how much either you as an individual or your property can afford and loan, and then working backwards from that degree of affordability to establish the most that they'd be willing to lend. Now, I think before any present value analysis happens, you need to give a lot of planning and forethought to how you're going to organize your analysis. And I think this is really the best foundation for any kind of discounted cash flow analysis, and in particular if your goal has something to do with present value calculations. So my recommendation is really just to organize what you think is going to happen tomorrow. All the operating cash flows, all the resale cash flows, organize everything over the next handful of years, because once you've organized it in a particular way, it'll make the calculations that much easier. So for example, let's say you have an opportunity to purchase a property that has this future stream of operating rental cash flows. So you can collect rents, pay expenses, and what you have left over is $7,000 or $7,100, or with every period that goes by, a certain amount of cash flow. Now let's assume that at the end of year 4, you expect to sell the property for $125,000. So now all told, you have this combination of future expected cash flows, those from rental operations and those from selling the property at some point in time. Once you've organized everything, I think it's from here that you need to likely do the hard part, and that's deciding what your discount rate is. Now, I gotta confess, there's a completely different video that talks about discount rates, derivation of discount rates, what they are. But in this case, I'm assuming that we've already decided on what that number is. But just in case, the discount rate is your minimum required rate of return. So think of the discount rate as that minimum return that you need to earn in order to take on all the risk and potential opportunity that an investment may have. So if I present you with an opportunity to buy, let's say, an apartment building, you would evaluate the opportunity. So how much you can grow rents, or the risks, the vacancy, or the bad debt, or the operations, or the time, or the repairs necessary to earn those rents over time. So as you weigh risk and return, you'll define your minimum requirement. It's that minimum required rate of return that we'll use as that benchmark discount rate. But maybe more importantly, it's that discount rate that we'll use to estimate present value. And so it's really the combination of these two things, your organized total future cash flows and your discount rate, that will help us arrive at present value. As far as the math goes, I think the easiest way to think about this is, let's just take a look at each individual cash flow. I understand that we've organized 4 years worth, or maybe you have 10 years worth or more in front of you. But if we compartmentalize this and really just take a look at one period worth of time, and we apply this principle, then I think from thereafter, it's just repetition. So the general concept of the math behind present value discounting is, let's first take a cash flow that occurs in some period. So this is a cash flow that occurs in period N. N could be year 1, 2, 3, but whatever period we're looking at, just take a look at one cash flow. So this is cash flow in period N. And we're going to discount it, that's why we're dividing, by some discount rate plus 1. So in our previous example, it was 10%. So our R, our discount rate, would be 10%. The N would be the number of periods ahead in the future that that cash flow is taking place. So again, if we take a look at our prior example, cash flow period N, discount rate R, future period N exponent. So if $7,000 is the cash flow that we received in time period 1, 10% is our discount rate, and period 1 is 1 year from now, then we can complete this formula. We would discount $7,000 by 1 plus 10% raised to the exponent. So if we begin to kind of contract this equation, it would be $7,000 divided by 1.10, or $6,300 roughly. Now I think what's key here is for you to understand that we may have started off with a $7,000 number, but because we needed to wait to receive it, now we've introduced this concept of time and risk. So you may not actually collect it. Maybe all your tenants don't really pay, or maybe some of them vacate early, or maybe your operating expenses increase. So you may not actually collect that full $7,000 because of that risk, because of that time. We need to discount it. Because we're discounting, we're taking that number down. So $6,300. So I think it's probably best if we kind of expand this in Excel so you can really see how this works. All right, so here we have the exact same example. So we have years 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have operating cash flows, $7,000, growing marginally for the next 4 years. We sell the property in year 4 for $125,000. So this summarizes each of these annual cash flows. So if we were to do this in Excel, we would say equals our cash flow divided by 1 plus our discount rate. And we would increase it, or we would raise it, I should say, to whatever number of periods that have elapsed. So 1, for example. So in this case, just to walk through it, we're going to take $7,000 and divided by 1 plus our discount rate raised to the number of periods that we needed to discount. You'll notice we arrived at the same number. So now we can really just repeat this process over and over again. So $7,100 divided by 1 plus 10% raised to the second power. $7,200 divided by 1 plus 10% raised to the third power. Excuse me. And then finally is $132,000 divided by 1 plus 10% raised to the fourth power. So now that we have all these individual discounted cash flows, what we're really looking for is the value today of all of these cash flows. So if we were to add them, this would give us the present value today of all these future cash flows. So if this is the longhand approach, now let's take a look at the shorthand approach. So again, same stream of cash flows, organized in the same way with the same discount rate. Now, Excel allows us to use something called the NPV function. I would ask that you not get too tripped up on the idea that we're using the NPV function to solve for present value, or PV. The reason we have to rely on NPV is because we have different cash flows every period. So we have 7,000, 7,100, 7,200, and so on. These cash flows change with every period. And because of that, the PV function in Excel is not flexible enough to estimate the sum total of variable cash flows. NPV, however, is. So if we use equals NPV function, open parentheses, we'll pick our discount rate, comma, and then we'll just select all of these future streams of cash flows in one group. When I press close parentheses and enter, we'll arrive at the exact same number. So again, equals NPV, open parentheses, and discount rate, then select all your cash flows. It'll get you to the exact same number. All right, so now let's talk about a handful of important considerations. So the higher the discount rate, the lower the present value. Now, I think this concept is going to be very valuable, but before we even get into it in Excel, let's think about this outside of the real estate or financial context. Let's imagine you wanted to buy a gift for your significant other, you go shopping, and you hear that there's a retailer or some kind of store that's offering a big discount. What does that imply? That the original price has been cut, it's been lowered in some way. And the bigger the discount, the greater the lowering, or the greater the cut, so the lower the price. So if we think about that same concept here, the greater the discount rate, the more we discount, the lower the present value. So this is the exact same example we had in the prior slide. So watch what happens if we change the discount rate. If we increase it to, let's say, 20%, we would expect that present value would come down because we're discounting more. And so actually, the more we discount, the lower this present value becomes. It's the same process. We're taking the exact same cash flow. The cash flow hasn't changed. We're just discounting it more. So there's this inverse relationship between the discount rate and the present value. So therefore, the opposite is true. If we discount less, if we don't discount by as much, then we would expect the present value to increase. The next consideration to keep in mind is the greater the time elapsed, the more that discounting occurs. And I'd ask for you to kind of keep your lottery example in mind. Because you needed to wait 150 years, some of you may have admitted that $500 million isn't worth anything to you. You've discounted almost to zero, if not all the way to zero, because you needed to wait so much time. So the less time that elapses, the less discounting occurs. I'd also ask you to keep in mind that you should not discount time period 0. Remember, the definition is the present value of future cash flows. Time period 0 is today, it's this very second. So in this example, if we had this very same stream of cash flows, but I introduced time period 0 as the day that you actually purchased the property, there's no risk there. There's no risk in the present. You know exactly what right now is in terms of expectation or risk or uncertainty. So because of that, we don't discount time period 0. We only discount future cash flows, everything after time period 0. Don't forget the resale cash flow. So oftentimes a mistake that I'll see people make is that they'll go through a lot of lengths to estimate what they think operating cash flows will be, but then they leave out the resale cash flow from that process. Remember, we're taking total cash flows, those from operations and those from sale. And then finally is to use dynamic inputs versus fixed inputs in your Excel formulas. So if you'll recall, when I used the NPV function, I selected the cell that had my assumption, or I selected the cell that had my cash flows. I did not directly input 10% and then each individual cash flow. The reason being is, one, it's a lot faster. Two, it also makes it easier for me to change assumptions moving forward. So as cash flows changes or as discount rates change, in this case, the NPV function can calculate dynamically and the result can change automatically. The last is it also helps you reduce errors, fewer inputs for you to worry about or audit or have to change sometime thereafter. So just as a quick recap, we discussed what present value is, so the value today of a future stream of cash flows. We discussed how it's applied, so speaking about valuation, pricing, and how lenders could rely on present value either based on affordability or their estimate of value. Finally, we spoke a bit about how to calculate present value, longhand and shorthand, and the important considerations around those calculations. So as always, thank you for taking the time. If you have any questions, more than happy to speak in greater detail. And if you found this video helpful, I'd recommend you take a look at a handful of others. Talk to you soon.